So these are the fourth set of notes, and the majority of this is you just reading, and I am not going to read to you. That is not my job. So you need to read this first section about the definition of an experiment, and then here are some examples, or this is one example of components of an experiment, and then the difference between an experiment and an observational study. So in an observational study, you are observing. In an experiment, you're taking some kind of action. You're influencing something about the environment. And then I will help you with these three problems. So make sure that you pause the video, actually read the words. Take your time. It'll take you a few minutes. Just read the words. Your reading comprehension skills are great, and so I'm not reading to you. Let's look at examples 1, 2, and 3 here to see if they are an experiment or an observational study. A researcher is recording the weather conditions during 50 randomly selected accidents for the past year. The researcher is not affecting the environment. The researcher is just recording what has happened, so this is an observational study. In the second one, the researcher is growing one specimen in treated soil and growing another one in untreated soil. The researcher is physically doing something to the environment. This is called an experiment. And then in the third one, a scientist is measuring the heights of bird nests and counting numbers of eggs. So measuring and counting do not involve changing the environment. This is an observational study. Okay. So sampling is, again, I've mentioned this before, sampling is basically picking a subset of individuals from within a particular population to either do an observational study with them or to do an experiment with them, and then you would take those results from the sample and you would generalize it to the population. So let's look at some examples of this. A survey of this many American households found that 18% of households own computers. The sample are the American households that were actually studied. So the 1,353 American households studied are the sample, and the population is all American households. And so we looked at this subset and we made a generalization about all of American households. A recent survey of 2,625 elementary school children found that 28% of children could be classified as obese. So the sample is the 2,625 elementary school children that were involved in the study. And then we made a generalization about the population of all children. So all children is the population target that we were looking for. Part C, the average weight of every sixth person entering the mall within a 3-hour period was 146 pounds. So the sample was every sixth person entering the mall in the 3-hour period. And the population would then be, you would probably generalize that to the average weight of all people in the mall. All right. So now we're going to talk about different types of sampling. So different ways to get a sample population. So there are 5 basic ones that we're going to talk about. The first one is a simple random sample, SRS. This is when the individuals are chosen at random. It's kind of entirely by chance. And so here is an example. You can read this example. This is generally the best method of sampling. Most of the time when you do statistics, you want to sample using a simple random sample. The pros to this include that it is random. That's always a good thing. That means that we are more likely to be getting a valid subset of what we're actually trying to estimate, so it's random. But some reasons why people might not do this is that it is sometimes costly to be very thorough with it, and you may have non-response bias. We'll talk about that at the end. Non-response bias could happen at any point in time. It doesn't have anything to do with the sampling design that you've chosen. But also sometimes simple random sample is just cumbersome. There are sometimes a lot of factors involved in getting a random sample or ensuring that's actually going to be a random sample. So sometimes the data set is so big that it's easier to do a systematic random sample. So again, you can read the example here. So a systematic random sample is basically when you're going to pick people kind of randomly, but you have a preset system for doing so. So like you decide that you're going to interview every fifth person, or you decide you're going to interview, every 12th person or something. It's not systematic if you say, I'm going to interview everyone with red shoes, because there may be some kind of trend to why people are wearing red shoes for whatever reason. And so it's generally based on a random number to begin with, and then you just systematically choose people after that. So this is also, in general, a good method of sampling. Again, pros include that it is random. It's somewhat easier to design than a simple random sample, because you don't have to, you're kind of sticking with one random number, 5, and you're just taking every fifth person, rather than trying to continue to be random after that. You still might have non-response bias, where people simply don't respond, and so if they don't respond, you can't get information. You might not get enough information, and it still can be somewhat cumbersome to implement if you have a very large study that you're trying to do. So another type of random sample is the stratified random sample. So this is when you break a population up into subgroups, or they're called strata. That's why it's called stratified. And then you do random sampling within each subgroup. So here is an example. Again, I'm not reading it for you. Pause the video, read the example yourself. So is this a good method of sampling? In general, yes, it is. It still has the randomness about it, so that is good. That's what makes it a good sample. It also ensures that you are certain to have proper representation from each proportion. So in this case, extracurricular or non-extracurricular students. You're certain to have proper representation from each subset there. Cons are that this can be tedious to create, and therefore it can be costly, because if you're in the business world and you're paying someone to implement this study, you're paying them for their time. So the longer it takes them to do, the more time it's going to take and the more money it's going to cost you. And so sometimes, and you have to be wary of these last two sampling methods, is sometimes you might just do a convenience sample, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is simply convenient. And this is what you see happen most often when people decide, I'm gonna take a poll, or I'm gonna do a survey. They don't design it well, and so the actual results are not very helpful. They might be helpful for them. They might prove the point that they were trying to prove, but it doesn't mathematically and logically prove anything. So here you can read about a convenient sample. In general, this is not a good method of sampling because it is not random, and so the results may be insignificant. So you literally might be wasting your time. Statistically speaking, you might be wasting your time. But pros are, it is obviously convenient, it is easy, and cheap to do. And then another type of sampling that is also you need to be wary of is a voluntary response sampling, and you see this a lot on social media. So this is where you put a quiz out and let people vote on whatever, I don't know, what topping they want on their tacos next Tuesday, or you see a survey monkey, all of that stuff. These are voluntary response. You're not standing in front of someone marking if they respond or not. They literally have to choose to respond And so you often get, skewed results from that, or you get results that are not proportional to the population that you're trying to describe. So pros are that this is easy, cheap, it's also pretty convenient, but it is not random, and again, the results may be insignificant. So, question number 1. If we randomly poll 500 students, or we're polling 500 students, we're randomly selecting them proportional to the number of students enrolled in each degree program. This is a stratified system because we're making the subset is each degree program, and then we're pulling people proportional to that. So this is a stratified random sample. To do market research, telemarketing firm randomly selected 1,000 names from the database. This is a simple random sample. There was no systematic choice to it. They didn't pick every fifth name. They didn't break it into subgroups. It was not voluntary, and it was probably not convenient. So it was a simple random sample. All right, and then again, there's more reading for you to do. This is describing some problems in sampling bias. So this is caused by samples that are either not representative of the population, or possibly some other reason that the answers that you're given in the survey or in the questions you're asking are not valid for the population. Usually these are caused by poor design sampling. So there are really 5 types of bias that you need to read about. There's choosing a poor design. So we've talked about the 2 design choices that are not good to choose. Undercoverage bias is when a significant proportion is not sampled at all or was not well represented in the sample. And then there are 2 types of response bias. One is about the interviewer, him or herself, and one is about wording, how you're actually asking the questions. And then there's non-response bias where maybe you just choose not to, you don't get enough people that choose to respond, and so your results are not valid. Biased results are meaningless. Statistically speaking, they have no meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that media or, you, if you're doing your own poll, that doesn't mean you won't report those and try to convince people that what you found is meaningful. But statistically speaking, biased results mean nothing. And that's where you have to be a savvy consumer, and you have to think critically about what you're hearing when people report that they've done whatever survey or poll or whatever they have found that they're reporting on. So again, pause the video and read about sampling design problems and different types of bias. All right, and so the practice questions, and I scribbled that out, that's not the correct answer. A radio station asks listeners to call in. This is a type of sampling. This is a voluntary response sampling, and this is not a good sampling design. So this could be considered sampling bias because the sampling design is not a good choice. Voluntary response is not usually random. It's not usually representative of the entire population. You could also probably argue non-response bias because, well, what if no one calls in, or what if no one chooses to do the survey, or what if only one person does? That's almost even worse. Whatever that one person believes is now going to be generalized to the whole population. So you could probably see either one of these. It's not response bias because they're just asking questions, and they're not going to be getting any kind of either interviewer or wording bias in the response. We would have to look at the individual words to make sure of that, but the question doesn't lead us to think that it would be response bias. Question number 2, which question is biased? Do you prefer daytime or evening television programming? That one's fine. Should there be a school dress code? That one's fine. Do you prefer news or mindless sitcoms? This question has some wording bias right here. If it had just said, do you prefer news or sitcoms? Cool, no problem. This is very straightforward. You're not implying anything with your wording. But when you put the word mindless in front of sitcoms, you're implying that if someone says, oh, I prefer mindless sitcoms, you're implying that they then see themselves as mindless. which they may not, or they may not want to say that. So when you word it that way, they may have thought sitcoms at first, but then they might want to say, oh no, I prefer news, because they want you to perceive them, you as the interviewer, to perceive them as maybe not mindless. And so this is the one that has bias. Do you think a new highway should be built? That's also no bias there.